When it comes to writers in the industry today, there are many who stand out, but if you were to ask me, when it comes to the very best at writing dialogue, nobody comes close to Quentin Tarantino. So what's the deal with Tarantino? Why is his dialogue just so hypnotising? Well, there are many reasons why, but I think a great place to start is the first scene of an indie film you might have heard of called Pulp Fiction.
Forget it, it's too risky.
That was it, the very first line of the movie, and he already has the viewer's attention. And the reason he's grabbed us is because he uses a very specific device, and it's a device that is not often talked about. In fact, it's talked about so little, it's a device that doesn't even have its own name. So because of that, it's something I've come to call the pledge. Now, please bear in mind, this is just my own thinking. The pledge is not some famous literary device, but just a little phrase I've coined to try and understand how to tell a good story. Simply put, a pledge is a promise to the audience that at some point in the future, whether it be far off or immediate, something interesting will happen. And Tarantino is the master of the pledge. It's how he already has the viewer's attention within the first 5 words of the film. When he says,
"Forget it, it's too risky,"
the line is essentially saying that they are planning something, and what they're planning is very dangerous. Naturally, dangerous things are going to interest the viewer, so for the next few minutes, that pledge is stuck in the viewer's mind. What are they planning? Why is it so risky? The viewer doesn't know exactly what it is, but what they do know is that something dangerous is going to happen. All that investment created from only 5 words said. And of course, a pledge doesn't necessarily have to promise just conflict, or even conflict at all, because if conflict were the only thing that an audience would find interesting, then all movies and stories would be nothing short of one long argument or fight sequence. So to better understand the pledge, let's look at another way Tarantino uses the device. Let's look at The Hateful Eight. So here's the summary. Major Mark West, Sam Jackson's character, had a massive Confederate bounty on his head because he broke out of one of their most famous prisons.
You bust out?
Major Marquess did more than bust out.
Major Marquess had a bright idea. So bright, you got to wonder why nobody never thought about it before. Tell John Ruth your bright idea.
You want to know what he says next, right? And the fact I just paused that clip at that moment almost annoyed you, because you want to hear the story of how he broke out of prison and gained a bounty on his head. That's the whole point, and that is the pledge in action. It's one of the reasons Tarantino writes such great scenes, because he often builds an anticipation towards the future, whether it be the next scene or simply the next line of dialogue. Not all, but many of his lines build a larger picture. They don't just serve themselves, but they also serve the next line, so the audience is kept in a perpetual state of wanting to know what happens next. And that's why it's just so hard to stop watching a Tarantino film, especially when there's an exchange of dialogue. In relation to the first line of Pulp Fiction, I can imagine you might ask, but that line of dialogue,
"Forget it, it's too risky."
that isn't a pledge, that's a hook. And you'd be right, that line is a hook, just like a great line of prose at the start of a good book that grabs the reader's attention. But this line also serves the purpose of being the pledge for the scene. And then, you might ask, so aren't a hook and a pledge the exact same thing? Well, not really. A pledge is more fundamental to telling a good story, because a hook is cheap. It grabs the viewer's attention. A pledge maintains it. And I think what's worth noting about Tarantino and his scenes is how there is always conflict in them. Let's look at the start of The Hateful Eight. The first scene, the Major is held at gunpoint in a tense first encounter with another character. The second, they are having an argument on whether a bounty should be taken in dead or alive. The third, they have a tense encounter with another man where he claims to be the sheriff and they don't believe him. The fourth, the 3 characters have an argument about the Civil War, which ends with a gun pointed in someone's face. The next, they meet everyone in the haberdashery and they are all very suspicious of one another. With a few exceptions here and there, in Tarantino's films, every scene, every conversation, every line of dialogue has some conflict attached to it. There is always something at stake in a Tarantino scene, whether it be something as simple as a character losing an argument about a foot rub to being discovered as a spy, or just being shot. Because there is always something at stake, there is always conflict, which is the core of any good story. When it comes to writing great dialogue, there is another quality that makes said dialogue interesting that many writers fail to capture, and it is something that Tarantino has proved time and time again that he is a master of, and that quality is subtext. And what is subtext? Quite simply, it's what is not said. It is the show don't tell rule applied to dialogue. It is the difference between the words that come out of a character's mouth and the thoughts that stay in his head. So, as a purely hypothetical example, let's say there is a German officer in World War II and he comes across 3 American soldiers who are trying to pass off as Italians. However, he knows full well that they are in fact spies. How would a bad writer write that scene? Well, it might go something like this. The Americans try to speak Italian, but miserably fail. The officer's face drops as he realizes that they are lying, and then he tells them something along the lines of, "I know you are spies, and you are screwed." So that isn't exactly terrible dialogue, but it could be made a lot more interesting, and what more, by a pure coincidence, Tarantino has a scene exactly like that with that subtext in Inglourious Basterds. However, he handles it far more gracefully. So the subtext, Hans Lander, the German officer, knows that the 3 Americans are pretending to be Italian. So then, this happens.
Gorlami. Mi scusi, con me? Gorlami.
Ancora una volta.
Gorlami. E lei?
Dominic De Coco.
Come?
Dominic De Coco.
Bravo. Bravo.
This conversation is incredibly well done. It would be normal to ask someone their name, but he makes them repeat it again and again with a smile, and when he turns to the left one, who pronounces his name authentically, Lander slaps him on the back and says, "Well done." Now, when I first saw this scene, I thought that Lander was trying to figure out if they were Allied spies or not, and I didn't notice the clues hidden in the dialogue, but in this conversation, Lander straight out confesses that he knows they are Allied spies, because no person would ever applaud a man for doing his own accent correctly. On the screen, it is incredibly subtle, to the point that many viewers, even after multiple viewings, could easily miss it, but he begins to compliment one of them specifically on how well he is imitating being the Italian he is pretending to be, and if Lander thought they really were Italian, he would have never said "well done" or asked them to repeat their names so many times and let out such a grin every single time they say it.
Antonio Margareti.
Ancora?
Margareti.
Un'altra volta, ma adesso vorrei proprio sentire la musica delle parole.
Margareti.
That right there is a perfect example of well done subtext. A bad writer would have each and every line of dialogue surface level. Every character would say exactly what they mean to say, and nothing would be left to the imagination, but Tarantino has an abundance of subtext to many of his lines. There is often a hidden purpose or train of thought that is incredibly easy for the viewer to miss and be none the wiser to, but for a perceptive viewer, all those little nuggets of subtext make that dialogue just that little bit more witty, just that little bit more fun to watch. But if you were to ask me, the real Tarantino style, the real area of his filmmaking where his talent truly shines, is in how Tarantino creates suspense and holds that suspense over the course of a long scene. What sounds on the surface to be quite a simple task is in practice exceptionally hard to pull off. Now, there are many examples of Tarantino creating this long-form suspense, such as the story about how the general's son was murdered in The Hateful Eight, or the poisoned coffee scene from the very same movie, but I think one of his very best